Hi, I'm Jennell Jaquays. My claim to fame, other than being married to Becky Heineman, is I was the manager, creative director of the game design group at Coleco during the entire life cycle of the ColecoVision and the ADAM. That was my start in video games, but where I actually started was not in video games. My roots are in tabletop role-playing games. 1975, I was a junior in college and working in the college radio station where I was spinning discs and spinning tapes, and my brother calls me up on the phone. Now, the thing to understand in my family, my brother is the actual gamer. So he calls me up and says, hey, I've got this magazine they sent me for free, and in it are these 2 reviews of this game called Dungeons and Dragons. And he proceeded to read the 2 reviews to me. And I'm certain for many of you, there have been points in your life where you recognize either at the time or later that your life is changing and going in a different direction. That was one of those moments. I had a new focus. And so we ordered the game, and then about 3 months later, I finally was able to play it for the first time and realized that I really like doing this. And it was a market for doing my artwork. I could send them art, they would send me money. Just throw art at them, they sent me money. So I saw a potential for a career here. Well, the other thing we were doing is being a creative person, having a background already in doing publishing, like for school publications. I said, hey, with my friends, I said, hey, why don't we print our own fan magazine? And we did. We got permission from TSR to use the name, and we produced a fan magazine for 6 issues, about 1.5 years worth, of a magazine called The Dungeoneer. By the time we were done, we were selling it, copies of it around in hobby stores around the world, sending out subscriptions. But at the end of the day, I needed to sell it because I needed to graduate from college. And it was taking up time, and I had commitments to people, so I couldn't do both. So skip ahead. I ended up working in the tabletop game industry for about 1 year as a designer. Products that, if you're in tabletop, you'll be familiar with Dark Tower, game adventure for Dungeons and Dragons, and the Caverns of Thracia. Those are my 2 early career high. People are still playing these 45 years later. In fact, they're being republished in expanded editions 45 years later. I don't get it. I didn't realize that 22-year-old me knew what I was doing. Well, I quit that job after 1 year. I felt like I could do better. And you know, the 1979 minimum wage they were paying me, I could do better. And I almost did, for about 1 year. And then I met a friend at a game convention named Mike Stackpole, who said, hey, I'm working at a game company right now on a short contract. They need 1 more designer. Would you be interested? Well, this time I was kind of slowly going broke. Not necessarily getting enough clients to meet my bills. So I said, sure. And I went and interviewed with this company called Coleco Industries in Hartford, Connecticut. Now, they flew me from the Midwest to work to their offices in Connecticut, which for me was a big deal back in around late 1980. And I got the job. I interviewed with a gentleman named Eric Bromley, who was the head of advanced research and development at the time. And they expected me to start the next day. And I kind of went, no, I need to go home and resolve my affairs back in Michigan. So about a week later, I was on staff working at Coleco, and we were working on our first product together. They had these hot new technologies. Now this is 1980, the end of 1980, that they were trying to develop for toys. One was a barcode reader. The other was phoneme chips. I think it was a TI phoneme chip that you could string the phonemes together and produce things that sounded like words. So Mike and I were working on a role-playing game for this. That's why they brought us in. So we did this very simple move around, feed the cards with a barcode on the back through the player, and it played sort of a kind of simple role-playing game. Well, when it was all said and done, there were other game variants, but Coleco said, nah, we're not going to go ahead with this. It doesn't do what we want. And that was pretty much in the toy industry. Most of the things you try to come up with end up in the trash. Very few get all the way through. Well, the product didn't go, but they said, hey, we would like you to come work with us permanently. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Here's our agenda. So now I'm at Coleco, and what I want you to come away with this is, how did I get there? I just told you that. Who did I work with? What did we make? And how did we make it? So by the time you're done, maybe you'll have an idea what it was like working inside one of the big game companies in the early 80s. Why are we here today? Good question. So I want to make it clear, this is a story told, most of you have heard the story of Coleco. If you're a Coleco fan, you've heard the stories. They came from the top executives. They told you about sales. They told you about licensing. What they didn't tell you about was the people who worked on the project. And that's what really matters to me about working there, was the people. So, where's our key learning executive? And then, here we go. I'm going to leave this up for a while. This is my outline. I've already told you about how Dungeons & Dragons changed my life. Hello, Coleco. I didn't expect to be there. I didn't expect to stay there 5 years. I was in the right time, at the right place, with maybe the right skills. I was more of an adventure game designer and an illustrator, which for a toy designer in 1980, maybe not the right skills. Engineering and concept, industrial engineering art were really what toys were about then. So I worked at Coleco for several months, about 6 months, and then there was the dreaded reorganization. And my department, Advanced Research and Development, which had been a number of designers, a director, secretaries, and a lot of engineers and technicians, almost went away. All the technical side was taken and put over in the engineering department. My boss, Eric Bromley, had lost a battle. We went from having a nice office at one end of the building to kind of a closet in the depths of the basement of Coleco. So the people I worked with at that time on the design side was my manager, who was a man named Tom Helmer. He had been an electronics technician in the Army and stationed overseas listening to what the Russians were saying. I had the other engineer in there was Jay Belsky. His dad, a little bit of nepotism here, that was pretty big at Coleco. His dad was the vice president of purchasing. But Jay was a really talented, really intelligent engineer, and he had a lot to do with their early electronic toys, designing the toys. So did Tom. So I'm sitting there, this role-playing game designer. We're all sitting in the basement. We're playing D&D occasionally, or superhero games. Not really having any direction because our direction had been taken away. And then my boss brings down this simulator. And the simulator plays Galaxians using LEDs. They said, play this. And so we played it. And I said, yeah, this plays like the arcade game. We ended up with a simulated vacuum display tube that had graphics inside. When I say vacuum display tube, think of the tubes inside TVs. Same technology, except a flat screen. And as you cross the right wires with electronic signals, images glowed inside. And so you could create the illusion of movement across the screen by lighting up discrete images across the screen. So you could get bullets appearing to shoot. You could get ships moving across. You could get spaceships marching down the screen. So we ended up with the first, what became known as the tabletop arcades that Coleco would do. And we did 2 of them that year. We did the Galaxians arcade, and we did the Pac-Man arcade. Pac-Man was just getting really big around that time, and we managed to get the license for this simulated arcade game. And it went on to sell 4 million units at Christmas that year. It was a big deal. We found out at the CES that people were offering sex if they could get a handle on one of those units. But my involvement with that primarily was tweaking the graphics on the screen, which played into the next one we did. Coleco had gotten this license for a game called Donkey Kong. I'd never heard of it at that point. I honestly wasn't a big arcade player, but it was their newest game. And if you go online, look at the Wikipedias, you'll probably find the actual story behind getting that. I actually had nothing to do with that. I was down in a basement sitting across a cocktail table with Jay Belsky, and we were playing the game over and over and over with stopwatches and measuring tapes, figuring out proportion of movement, timing, what aspects of the game were important. And then we translated that into a vacuum fluorescent display screen that played 2 of the levels that simulated, and I'm going to say simulated, the play of Donkey Kong. That was my first experience doing that kind of actual level of design. I actually did the artwork that appears on the vacuum fluorescent display. That's my technical artwork in there. That prepared us for the next thing that happened. Around the same time we were developing the arcades for the tabletop, Eric Bromley and some engineers, Jay and another gentleman named Bob. I don't remember his first name. I just remember him Bob because it was the Jay and Bob show. They developed technical specs for a new arcade console called the ColecoVision. And the big deal behind that is, from a manufacturing standpoint, it used off-the-shelf parts. Primarily was a TI graphics chip that was in the TI color computer and a Z80 processor. Now that's about as technical as I'm going to get in this speech. That's my level of involvement with the tech side. But they came back to us and said, okay, we're also going to go out and get all these arcade licenses, starting with Donkey Kong. Internally, we were ARD, Advanced Research and Development, suddenly had new life. We were bringing in new engineers. We were stealing engineers from the engineering department. Our one programmer we had was named Zachary Smith. He started working on an operating system for the ColecoVision. I made some choices that stole 13 seconds from everyone's life every time they booted a cartridge. I made the decision to have that screen hold for 13 seconds because we wanted you to see that title of the game, figuring you couldn't read it faster. So I apologize for that. I probably own millions of hours of people's lives. So we started working on that, and then they said we need to simulate that Donkey Kong to work on the ColecoVision. And the first thing we realized was the way the arcade has worked, they took the TV monitor and they stood it on its side. And if we wanted to simulate that, we were going to need a lot more graphics space than if we made a few adjustments and could reuse a lot of the tiles inside the artwork. And I drew some of the first samples of the character, what the character would look like for not only for this, the Donkey Kong game that they started simulating by programming an Apple II to drive the graphics chips and sit beneath the console at Toy Fair. So the original Toy Fair module was not being run by the actual hardware. There was an Apple II hidden beneath the man behind the curtain. So we started working on all these games. I'm doing some designs for Donkey Kong, trying to get that on to the screen, and then realizing, you know, we can't do this by ourselves. We need more people. We need designers. We need artists. Where do you find video game designers who aren't programmers and video game artists in February of 1982? Those jobs didn't exist yet. I was one of the first. So we're on the East Coast. We're not in California, where in theory all those people are. So I started hunting around and found, wow, you know, I'm a role-playing game designer. Why not go back to my roots? And so my first hire was a gentleman named Lawrence Schick, who at the time, just before that, had been a vice president at the TSR, the people who published Dungeons and Dragons. He'd been the head of their development group, production group, and had quit in disgust recently. So I hired him and brought him in, and he became my first senior designer. A little while later, we brought in someone Lawrence knew named Kevin Hendricks, brought him up from Austin, Texas. And so we had this core of this people, and what we were doing was we were observing arcades and documenting how they played. Because when we gave the arcades, we got nothing. We have a unit sitting in the room here, and we had to figure out how whatever that arcade played, how it would play on a Coleco. And of course, we didn't have any ColecoVisions yet either, so we were kind of making big guesses because we had one internal development team, later two, working on these cartridges. We did two of the games internally, if I remember immediately. Donkey Kong was being programmed by Zach Smith, and Smurf Adventures, or Smurf Rescuing Gargamel's Castle, was being programmed by Michael Dougherty. I did some of the first sketches for the Smurf because I was the only artist available at the time. And then we started bringing in the artists. Well, where do we find these artists? Well, we advertised in, I think, the paper, local paper. We got a couple of kids who had just graduated from university. Chuck Lockhart was the first artist to go work on video games at Coleco. He had just graduated from the Payer School of Design. We hired a young woman named Robin Lockwood. She had graduated recently from Connecticut University. Neither of them had worked with pixels. They were illustrators and art students. We just kind of threw them into it, and they started figuring out systems. And the system turned out to be big sheets of graph paper, 300 wide, 256 tall, I think, that would represent the actual resolution of the screen of a ColecoVision. And then these were subdivided down into 8 by 8 tiles, because we built the games out of tiles. And the most efficient use of the tiles was, how many times can we reuse these tiles in a background scene or in a character? So they started designing this, and we started buying up the entire stock, I think, of Marvy markers, watercolor markers, in 16 different colors from our local art supply stores. Because all the ColecoVision game screens, all the animations, all the characters were first hand-drawn on graph paper. And then we sent photocopies of those to the developers. And then they would, initially they were all responsible for hex coding in. That's the other thing we learned how to do, is how to hexadecimal code a line of art. So we're starting to produce these vast amounts of documentation. We're standing in darkened rooms where there's several arcade units with tape measures and stopwatches taking documentation. We're writing down descriptions of how these games played. The end goal was to not only develop documentation that we felt could be reliably interpreted as a video game, but to establish a Coleco style. How would these play? And Becky was talking earlier in her speech about instruction manuals. Well, the Coleco instruction manual was intended to be thrown away. We never expected anyone to read those manuals. The biggest phrase we had in it was something called the fun of discovery, which meant if you can't, you need to be, we want to design these games so you can figure out how they play by just poking around in them. And if there's any secrets in there, you're going to find them that way. So we're making arcades. And by the time we started, we were in full swing. I think we had roughly 10 artists and 10 designers. And we were producing documentation that went out of house to multiple different studios around the world, mostly in the US, but around the world, developing our cartridges for us. They would send their ROMs, because everything was done through ROMs. We had one developer we did digital transmitting with, and that was in Japan. They were in Japan. And that was the Buck Rogers game on the ADAM computer. And that's, as people might say, that was a story in itself. So we're bringing in we're writing this documentation. We're talking anywhere from 30 to 60 pages of single space type per game. Dozens, if not hundreds, of pages of graphics, photocopies of color photocopies, 1982 color photocopies of the images that we would send out. And then the designer who had been writing the specs became basically the assistant producer on the product. We actually had producers in-house. They were more business number crunchers. The designer managed the product, managed the contact with the developer, brought it in, oversaw the testing. Typically, a designer working on a project would have at least four in production. And they would be on multiple systems. When we did the first year, I remember we did Smurf, we did Zaxxon, Turbo, Donkey Kong. I'm certain there was a few others that I'm going to forget, but we were doing them on the ColecoVision, the Atari, and the Intellivision, all at the same time. And we were accused that we were intentionally making the games on the other consoles bad. Because the ColecoVision ones looked so good. They looked like the arcades. Well, no, we weren't. We were working with the best people we knew who could program these. And you just couldn't do good simulations of arcades on an Atari until they started figuring out more tricks. We're talking 1982, so we were still pre a lot of the amazing things being done on the... But on the Intellivision, I'm not certain anyone external to the Blue Sky group actually ever really figured out how to best do Intellivision cartridges. So they were a nightmare to work on, to test. Nobody enjoyed it. And then we started getting some other challenges in. Zaxxon. Now, Zaxxon, if you know the arcade game, is a diagonally scrolling game where the game scrolls diagonally down the screen, and you've got enemies coming here, and you're trying to negotiate a three-dimensional space and avoid objects coming at you. Now, it works in the arcade because they've got lots of processors to handle all that, and they aren't working with tile graphics like we were. So the group we were working with at the time was 4D Interactive Systems, and they figured out how to do an amazing tile shifting system to where we could get the program to shift in four pixel units. So we only had to draw duplicates, half duplicates of each tile. And then most of the other things that were sitting on the world became sprites. So you see a little flickering occasionally when your spaceship's coming up and down or the enemies are coming in. That worked, but then we had to translate, try and make it work on the Atari and the Intellivision. And my mind says we never shipped those, but that may not be true. I may just be blocking those out. They couldn't simulate that on those systems, so we ended up doing trench versions. And I think they looked at them and said, "No, we're not going to go ahead with that." But we also did a tabletop version. A group came in and showed us how they could simulate that same look in the video game using vacuum fluorescent displays. 2 vacuum fluorescent displays and mirrors. So the background scrolled across the screen on one display. Your spaceship and bullets and a few other things were all on the reflected display, so it looked like you were flying over the world and above the other screen. A lot of people, that just was like magic. But the same designer who worked on, it was Lawrence Schick, the same designer who worked on all the other versions of the arcade also worked on the tabletop. So we get a lot of, we're making the same documentation we're writing for each system work across multiple systems. So one of the things I'd like to mention is I talk about this, the people mattered here. Their names get lost to history, and since this is being recorded to history, I'd like to mention a few names of people who worked on these games. On the design side, they had me. I was the manager, then chief designer, then finally director of design, and that was for the entire life cycle once we started doing ColecoVision. I also worked on a few of the video games myself, but that was just because I wanted to have a hand in the creative aspect. Lawrence Schick, he came to me as the former VP of TSR. Kevin Hendricks, another TSR designer. Dr. B. Dennis Sester, he was a professor at a university in New York who didn't get tenure. But He was a tabletop game designer. He designed several board games and some materials. He designed a game called Bunnies and Burrows for tabletop role-playing games. Tom Fulton, he was my only designer with no design background. But during his interview, he convinced me that he could do the job. And he ended up doing some of our greatest titles. Arnold Hendrick, another former tabletop designer. John Butterfield, who came out of another board game company called SBI, but he'd also been an animator for a commercial animation company in New York. Joe Angiolillo. Joe was someone who worked for a local game company, and we met him in line when we were waiting to go watch the Return of the Jedi movie on an afternoon where we all played hooky from work to go see the movie as soon as it was in the theater. Michael Price, another ex-TSR, probably the only person in the team who had previous programming experience. Phil Tatarzinski, if you played the Jeopardy or Wheel of Fortune, no, Family Feud computer games in the early 80s. They were supposed to come out on the ADAM, but Phil was the designer of them on the ADAM computer, and they came out on other systems from other companies later on. David James Ritchie was another ex-TSR, ex-PSR designer, and Ken Totten. Ken was a kind of an entrepreneur board gamer and the last person to join the team. He was also the first person to leave the team when they did layoffs, unfortunately. On the art side, we had Chuck Lockhart, our first designer, our first artist, Robin Lockwood. Juan Sanchez was our animator. He did the animation for every single character animation in every single ColecoVision game that we did, from Donkey Kong through Blackjack Poker, the Tarzan game. Juan did the animations. His previous credits were working as an animator on the Raggedy Ann and Andy movie in New York City. Also, if you've ever played the Ken Houston Blackjack game, the dealer looks like Juan. Mark Palmer. Mark was, when we were just trying to bring in as many artists, Mark was a house painter. He had some art degrees. He ended up, he was the one I remember, he was the artist on Carnival. Robin Hebb came up out of New York City. She worked on machines that made slides. Back when everything, like a presentation I'm doing now, was done with actual physical slides. They had machines that made them. Frank Lamb and Jessica Peely, they were what I considered, they were the kids from New York. But they were two of our most talented stylists for doing video game conversion art. Dave Johnson, another slide creator, but he eventually replaced me as head of the art group. He took over as director and managed that team because I could no longer split myself between both groups. He had Suzanne, who was his right-hand person, and then the final person to come in was Deb Lazarus. Deb I still stay in contact with. One of the things that people don't realize is when we were staffing up to get game designers, we brought in the guys we brought in one of the co-designers of Dungeons & Dragons, Dave Arneson, and he brought two of his staff, Steve Lortz and Aaron McKee, and they worked with us for several months, documenting games, just because we didn't have enough hands to do it all up front. We were trying to really bang out a whole lot of titles at once. Our programmers that I remember, and this was in the ColecoVision era, Zach Smith, Michael Doherty, Ken Legacy was the guy who did all the sound for the first year of games. He would be joined by a couple others, but they all came from the Hartford Symphony Orchestra. That was their background. They were professional concert musicians. Reggie Dion, Leon Gray, Ao Nguyen and Dave Schwartz. I think that was his name. Ao, I remember specifically, y'all remember the Cabbage Patch Kids, that everyone had their own unique name. Ao wrote the program for the production side that wrote all those names out. Then we had our tech writers who wrote our instruction manuals and a lot of our style guides, and that was Michelle Van Schouwen. She was our head writer. She was replaced later by Mary Guth Fulton. Robert Bessel, Chapita Lyons, Ed Zagorski, and Deborah Ritchie. They not only wrote the manuals for the games, they also wrote a lot of the ADAM computer manuals. So they were actually having to pull some weight there. One of the topics that comes up is, why did the ColecoVision game have, or the box, the original retail box, have all these games on it that never came out? That's because Coleco was trying to convince you that there were going to be a lot of games on it. A lot of them did come out, but there's always the lingering ones, like what happened to Tunnels and Trolls? What happened to Dracula? Why was there no skiing game? Well, some of the changes, and then there were some arcades that never showed up. Some of it is we lost the licenses. Others because Coleco management didn't think the licenses were strong enough to carry into video game titles. But we had these screens. Now, for the box, one of the things is, I told you we were working with pixel art for all the screens. We gave those pixel layouts to an ad agency, and they used cut paper to simulate the color fields of the video game. So every one of those little screens on the front of the box, sides of the box, was made out of cut Pantone paper by someone outside. We didn't have to touch that. Oh, let's see here. So I want to talk about Madam, I Am Adam. One of the brainchilds of my boss, Eric Bromley, and a few other people, was that we would turn the ColecoVision console into a computer. Now, I'll be honest, it was an idea that was ahead of its time. A packaged home computer, easily accessible at under $600, under $700, that you could buy at a toy store. And then there's the caveat. It was being produced by a toy company. Now, we had good engineers, we had great plastic engineering, design, but it kind of fell apart on the actual electronic side because it was more than they'd ever tried before. And it got a lot of failures, barely passed certification. And then there's always the rumored story of the time the printer, which was a separate unit that contained the power supply, was left to run on a endurance test over the weekend in the company's computer clean room and caught on fire. True story. But we had the computer, and this was at the beginning when the end was coming. The thing is inside Coleco where we were working, we never knew a thing. We were isolated from the outside world. We did not know what was going on in the actual industry except for the wealth of cartridges that were showing up in KB Toys at $5. The games we were making for we made the games for the ADAM. The real difference between an ADAM computer game and a ColecoVision game was just more content. It's the same game. It's just more content. We can't get any more stuff on the game, but we can get more stuff stored. And then the crash began. And I remember, this is where I'm getting into, I remember being with two of the guys from marketing at an arcade show in Chicago and hearing them talking about what was going on in the industry and not really comprehending that we were seeing the end. We were just walking down the street, and the head of marketing, video game marketing, and one of our producers was, they were chatting about it. And it didn't really set into me until till just before Thanksgiving, when they said, I need some names from your department. If you had to let somebody go, who would it be? And the first two to leave were Ken Totten, our last in, and our artist, Chuck Lockhart, who was our first in. They were the first to be laid off over Thanksgiving break, 1984. And then it started the real layoffs. I call it the Bruce's Birthday Massacre, January 2nd. I call it that because my brother's name is Bruce. It was his birthday, and he was one of the QA testers at Coleco. They took half of the department across the street to a motion picture theater and explained to them that they no longer had jobs. And then I was asked to set up an attrition sheet for the people who remained. And they were the order that they would go over the next 6 months. And we started letting people go. As they finished their projects, we turned them loose. So we started getting down to a skeleton crew. Part of that skeleton crew decided, we want to make a lifeboat. We're going to stay with the company. We actually like it here. And they put together a marketing and production plan to make board games at Coleco. Presented it to the vice president of marketing, who might have been in charge of that. And we're told, no, Coleco is not a board game company. We will never do this. 2 years later, after we were all gone, they bought Selcho and Ryder, and the company that makes Scrabble and Trivial Pursuit. And they bought the company that made the Pop-O-Matic games. We were long gone by then. Then one of my designers came to me and said, Jennell, I've got a job with another company. I'm going to quit. And I told him, Joe, let me lay you off instead. So he got separation benefits. He still quit, but he got separation benefits. And then came June 1985. The month of May, I had actually spent away from the company. I was on jury duty. And the way it worked in Connecticut at Superior Court was you sat in a jury pool for an entire month, whether you sat on a trial or not. You went downtown and you sat in the courthouse. But when I got back, I probably kept my team employed for a month because of that. First week of June, I was homesick. My new manager, who was actually another director, equal to me in the company, called me up and said, we need you to come in because we're letting you go. And that ended my time. And everyone else in my group at Coleco, we were done. It's gone. In 1985, and it's gone. And so now I've got 10 minutes that I can take questions.
So when you mentioned earlier in the presentation how Dave Arneson and others from TSR had gradually, or at least temporarily, worked with you and your team at Coleco, it came to mind. I also know that you worked at id Software and Ensemble Studios later.
Yes.
In the vicinity of Sandy Peterson. I don't know if you worked with him directly. And it just brings to mind, what do you think about the interweave between tabletop design people in that industry and designing or making art and managing production in video games historically?
It was a slow start at first. The early video game designs didn't really need the talents, the true talents of RPG and board game designers. I brought them in because I knew they were competent technical writers who could write creative, who could analyze creative content and create it. I actually interviewed Sandy for a position with Coleco, and I think it was 1983. He was working in California at the time, and he said he wisely, after meeting Eric Bromley, decided, no, we're not going to come work out here. Then 12 years later, I think it was 1997, Sandy convinced me to come work for id Software. So, but by that time, there was more crossover between the industries, because people were shifting back and forth between working on tabletop games, working on video games. Video games actually had meaningful stories by that point that you could include.
Right.
Art became more than, how can I convert this complicated character into a 32 by 32 sprite? You actually could do original art. So people started moving. Like I say, someone mentioned to me earlier today, Errol Otis was a designer, went from being an artist at TSR to being a designer and artist on video games, as you could do more and more complicated content.
Thank you.
So if I remembered what you said earlier correctly, you said Michael Price came from TSR with
Yes.
programming experience.
Yeah,
And I was wondering, I mean, I'm aware of a Apple II game that was a conversion of the dungeon exclamation part.
there were two games.
Yeah.
There was two games that they worked on. One was the dungeon, and I can't remember what the other one, but yeah, Mike worked on at
Okay.
least one of those.
Yeah, that's a note. I mean, I discovered that game recently, somewhat recently, and I think it's just very cute in a way. Like the art style is very well done, and I thought even for just the basic machine language hybrid game. But anyway, so I was
Yeah, Mike came at, for those who also, for going flip on the computer side, Michael was the designer on the Spy Hunter conversion, arcade conversion, which was one of the really later games we did, and kind of knocked it out of the park on that one.
Are you aware of the FujiNet for the Coleco ADAM?
I am not, but I am not deeply involved in ColecoVision or ADAM fandom.
So you know the FujiNet is a cartridge that can connect to the Wi-Fi and download games. So now that you sort of know about it, what do you think? Does that would excite you that people can re-engage more easily with that system?
Oh yeah, I think it was still a decent system. Having other ways to get access to content than wares or stolen ROMs, etc. Yeah, I think that's great.
I was young. I needed the work.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. I was aware of the FujiNet system from some of the Atari meetings, but no, I didn't know it was for the Atom.
Yeah, there was one made for the Atom, and I'm hoping that people will make new stuff for it. Not a lot of people had used it or known about it, so maybe they'll become more familiar with it now that they can actually more easily use it.
That'll be cool. Yeah.
So one of the unique aspects of the ColecoVision was the controllers. You had the turbo controller, the roller controller, the super action controllers. Did the ideas for those come out of your design groups, or did those come from somewhere else?
The original design of the ColecoVision controller was supposed to have a spinner right here at the base. Now, if you think about using the controller, the spinner is, you move it like this. Now, take that meaty controller, that heavy controller, you've got a kid's hand, and you're going bam, 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 bam.
Yeah.
No, it wasn't going to work, so they cost reduced it out.
Okay.
Eric Bromley, I'm not done yet.
Yeah.
Eric Bromley, the head of the department, still wanted that spinner for the sports games.
Okay.
He was one of the key designers behind that big super action controller, which is, even though I was the design person working on it with our concept designers, I really didn't like that controller because it was big, and the accessory for it made it even bigger, and I have big hands, so it was big in my hands. And then those controls, while I love the colors, Eric was a clarinetist, And this is a natural type of movement for someone who's a musician with a woodwind. Not me. So I didn't really love it. And then you take that beautiful orange knob on the top with that steel shaft, and it's got 8 buttons inside. It was actually more difficult to control because those live buttons, understand, were harder to hit than the metal switches. And there was so much throw that you could do with that stick that would actually damage the rubber buttons.
They were a little fragile, I remember.
Yeah.
Driving controller. I will take personal responsibility for using the hand controller as the stick shift on it. My spouse at the time complained. She says, "No, that's supposed to be on the left in a turbo game, not the right." But we're Americans here, so we put our stick shift on the right. Roller controller. That was my baby. Not my design, not my idea, but what we had was we got the Slither game in because we were trying to go up against Atari Centipede. So we needed this controller, and again, my idea was, well, let's make the console, let's mount those 2 controllers on the side, and that you create that ball in the center, which was pretty good, except you could slide them left and right, you would whack those controllers, and if you did an extension on them like I did, whack, 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 whack. So, and I'm kind of proud of that roller controller.
Thanks.
First, I just want to say this was a really great session, really, really interesting.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, and I was going to ask, so are you retired today? And if so, like, what was the last role in this industry you were doing? And if not, what are you doing today?
I am semi-retired.
Okay.
I quit working for large video game companies in 2012 when I left. I was working for CCP, the company that makes EVE Online.
Okay. Yeah.
Except we were also doing the license for The World of Darkness, which was White Wolf's Vampire the Masquerade game. And I was the lead level designer on that game. Well, after 3 years there, I decided this game isn't going to go anywhere. It's where it should have been 3 years ago when I joined the company. And I had other things I wanted to do with my life. So I quit. During that time, I founded Old School, which is with Becky and 2 other women.
Yeah.
And we've created a small little video game company. I left that eventually because it ended up being mostly just tech work, and I had other projects. So today I'm doing tabletop role-playing again.
Nice.
I have a massive book that I'm working on, playing hooky from right now, called Central Casting, which is using dice to roll character backgrounds for tabletop games.
Very cool. Hey, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Well, thank you. You have been a great audience.